Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV. And we are in the second day of Airborne Week. And we, as you know, are covering airborne operations from across the globe, essentially, and over all parts of the war. It's not all about Normandy this week. In fact, we're not doing a single Normandy show this week in Airborne Week. We're off to Corregidor today, and we are talking about this book, Rock Force, by my guest, Kevin Maurer, who is a best-selling author and journalist and has written about numerous subjects, including Che Guevara and Osama bin Laden, and is going to join us today to talk about the 503rd PIR into Corregidor. So without further ado, I'll invite Kevin in. So good afternoon, Kevin. How are you doing?
Great, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. So, I thoroughly enjoyed your book, and it exposed a campaign that I didn't know much about. I'm glad I do now. And as I said in the intro there, you've written about a lot of variety of subjects and different eras. Were you looking to do something about World War II? Did this one turn up as an idea? How did you get the idea, and why focus on the 503rd?
I was looking for a book. I was looking for a book on on World War II. I felt like I wanted to tell a story in that era, and then my editor, Brent, his grandfather jumped on Corregidor. And so when he told me about that, of course, I pretended I knew a lot more than I did about it. And once I started digging in on it, though, and knew he would be interested in a narrative history about it, it seemed like a perfect fit, because I don't think many people understand or know really what happened in Corregidor, or, some of the precision that was necessary to actually jump onto a small island like that. So it was a great opportunity to write an airborne book that maybe hasn't been written already.
I mean, indeed, and as we'll find out later on, it is an airborne drop that pushed what was possible in terms of the drop zone, the wind speed, altitude, objectives, the time scale. I mean, we talked about Crete last night for 2 hours with Greg Way, and the complications the Germans had getting their forces to the right place, and that was 4 years earlier than we're talking about today. But so often the famous actions of the airborne, I mean, when we talk about Bastogne, they didn't even go in by parachute. It was in by truck, and yet it's heralded as an example of an airborne operation, because the troops there, the 101st in Bastogne, were paratroopers. But actually what the 503rd did, and other units in the Pacific, actually defines more what the US was setting up their parachute forces for, that real using what they've been trained to do, jumping out of aircraft into very specific drop zones. So and the other thing I was going to ask you is, we're talking about the fact before we went online about you've written about different eras. As someone who didn't know much about it, when you start to do your research work, do you think not having much previous information is an advantage or a disadvantage? Because of the historiography now of understanding World War II, so many books and looked at these subjects, and did you find it an advantage or a disadvantage?
I mean, it's a little of both. I mean, it's an advantage in that I hope I'm bringing a fresh set of eyes or a new approach. I approached it less. I'm not a historian. I'm a reporter. So I approached it like a news story. I approached it as if I was embedded with the 503rd during the jump. So I'd had some experience with the paratroopers in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I just treated it. I tried to get as close to the guys that I would have written about if I would have been there live. And I think that helps with readability, but also helps the reason why this book is a little more of a departure from the other two books that had previously been written about it, which are much more stuffy military histories that want to tell you the strategy. If you read the comments a lot on Amazon, what people don't like about the book is it doesn't give you a broad picture of what's going on. And that's by design, because I really wanted you to meet the characters, meet guys like Lloyd MacArthur, who eventually is awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions, Tony Lopez, Bill Calhoun. I wanted you to get to know them as humans and not just chess pieces that were moved around the island. So that was an advantage. A disadvantage is I had a steep learning curve. I had to really, I was familiar with World War II. I was familiar with the equipment. I was familiar with the tactics and that stuff, but I really had to learn, how does this plug into the bigger one? And to be honest, I feel like the Pacific is overlooked, except for like some high points, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the atomic bomb. Besides that, I didn't really understand how that island hopping worked. I knew about it, that it existed. So that was a steep learning curve for me.
But the advantage you have is that most of your readers won't have huge amounts of information about it either. So you're not telling them something that they will argue with. I mean, that's the thing. If you're writing a book about Market Garden or Bastogne, so many books before, so many historians have given their views of who went wrong there and who should have done this, that everybody's got their opinions, and you're never going to change people's mind. We just had that conversation as well about what they idea, but what they previously thought. But when you're tackling something that is essentially a fresh subject, it's really, it's you know, you're bringing something new to the table. And yeah, you're right. The problem with the Pacific is we have that one timeline we deal with. It leaps in these big leaps from Midway, and then later on it gets Iwo Jima, and then Okinawa, and the peripheral. And I don't mean that dismissive of the retaking of Corregidor and Manila, and the Philippines, but the big events sometimes relegate these side events to off that timeline, and therefore you're missing out. And the Pacific is very complicated. But anyway, well, as with always, you provide us a PowerPoint presentation. I did a couple of aerial photos of the area courtesy of my friend Tone, who's a pilot out there. So that'll give us a bit of color imagery. And we've got a couple of clips, silent clips taken in 1945. So, you know the format, Kevin. I kind of hand over to you, then I jump in with my points to clarify questions we have from viewers coming in. And viewers, as usual, if you have questions during the show or after the show, fire away, and I'll try and put them up on screen if they're interesting, and we'll go from there. So yeah, over to you, Kevin.
Well, okay, yeah, go ahead. So let's first take a look at the island here. So its nickname is the Rock. Corregidor comes from a Spanish word, which means like corrector or correcting. And what it is it sits in the mouth of the Manila Bay. If you look at the side map down here, you'll see it sits right in the front. And as ships would come into the island, they would stop at Corregidor. And so, you know, it started as a rocky volcano that kind of rose up into the mouth of the bay. It's about 4 miles in length. Let's see, 4 miles in length. First colonized by the Spanish. In 1898, the Americans take over the Philippines, and that's where it becomes really a fortress. The Americans invest a lot of money and time into making Corregidor this massive coastal defense fortress, massive artillery, coastal guns there to prevent ships from coming to Manila Bay. And what you'll figure out is even in the late 1800s to even World War II, Manila Bay is an integral part of the logistics chain. And as we were talking before, how you jump from island to island, you need Manila, you need the Philippines. And that's why it was an essential piece of that campaign, and why it was so important in 45 as they're moving towards Japan.
And we have those two routes in parallel towards Japan that we've talked about with Ian W. Toll and James M. Scott, for example. That there's the iron hopping, so the Iwo Jima Okinawa route. Then there's the Philippines route, and which commander gets preference, and where the logistical allocation goes is hotly debated in those last few months of the war. But I think you're right. I think the Philippines leg kind of gets overshadowed by the Iwo Jima leg because of the fame of some of the imagery as well, I think, that comes out of Iwo Jima. But yeah, important to understand the strategic importance of Corregidor.
And I think one thing before we move on to this, this is pretty much a flat map, right? So you get a good sense of what Corregidor looks like. And you'll see in some of the aerial photos in particular, just the topography. I mean, this looks fairly easy, but really what you've got to realize is that head part of the tadpole is a mountain, right? It's giant, and it looks like it's coming out of the water. And then you've got this. There's about midway through Malinta Hill right there. If you go to the right a little bit, right, yeah. So over it's like a little hump, and then you've got right over here. Malinta Hill here is another hill. And then you've got it kind of tapers out of the back end. And later, when they start talking about the plan, you'll see why Colonel Jones initially wanted to jump onto the airfield at the tail. But what they basically are told is they're going to jump on top of that mountain because, one, the Japanese defenses are arrayed to stop an amphibious assault. But more importantly, they'd have to fight over 2 hills to take the island. So the idea was that we'll jump on top of the hill, we'll take the hill immediately, set our defenses, and fight downhill. And then the amphibious assault that comes in right at the waist there between the larger tadpole head, top side, and Malinta Hill. And then they cut the island in half.
Yeah, and here,
there's
folks, is one of our first aerial photos where you can, and there's Bataan in the background there, and you can realise that the terrain is just, well, it's. We talked about Crete yesterday, and the terrain there, in some ways, is a parallel. You know, Greg was explaining that the topography of Crete, lots of hills, and it all becomes about these strategic high points. And as you say, better to land on the top high bit and have the enemy fight towards you, and you fight down towards them, than the other way around. It's that we've learned that since the first men engaged each other in combat 2,000 years ago. Always hold the high ground.
Which is funny because I wrote a book called No Way Out about a modern operation in Afghanistan in the Shock Valley, where they, despite that general lesson, were told they had to start in the bottom of the valley and fight up, and it doesn't end well. So the lesson, yes, but always followed, no.
That's indeed true, yeah. So anyway, I'll hand back to you.
Okay, so yeah, this is a great one. I thank you very much for putting these photos. This is another way of looking at the field there. This is at the tadpole, the tail, right? So you can see where the Japanese had come in 42, and that's where they landed, and then they fought. Malenta Hill, underneath Malenta Hill is a giant tunnel structure, and in that tunnel structure was General MacArthur's headquarters. It was also the government of the Philippines, when they were evacuated out of Manila, set up a structure there. So the Japanese were really trying to get to Malenta Hill, but the Americans were pretty sure that the Japanese had taken over all the fortifications, and so they had come in and they were in Malenta Hill now as well. So the idea was, instead of having to fight, like I said, two hills, you fight one. You let the amphibious guys get Malenta Hill, which that fight alone probably deserves a book, and then the topside assault by the 503rd. All right, here we go. This is the tunnel. This picture shows the surrender of American forces, and this is the mouth of Malenta Hill, or Malenta Tunnel, which is, so imagine that if you're looking at that, if you look up, there's a mountain behind it essentially, and in that tunnel, which you can now go in and tour, you can go down the main tunnel, and then you can see all these branches, and there's maps of it. And if you look at the map, it looks like someone laid a fish skeleton underneath a hill, and that's why you got that main spine, and then you have all those side tunnels. I got to crawl around these tunnels too, which was pretty good, with a historian from Australia who was awesome, and Paul Whitman took me into all kinds of tunnels, and this was one of them. We weren't able to crawl much in this one, only because this is a tourist site where you first get to Corregidor, they drive you down here and let you walk in it. They got a
interrupting you, how important was it visiting the location? Because I hate it when I'm reading a book by an author, a historian, about a place, and he inadvertently gives away, or she gives away, that they've never been there by some geographical mistake, and I kind of go, yep, you've never been there. It really, if it's about Normandy, I can spot if they've been there or not, because they don't mention a particular hill or a bend in a river or something. So, for you, did you visit there early in the writing process or halfway through? When did you go?
I went about 3/4 of the way in, and I did that on purpose because I wanted to get my arms around the story. I wanted to kind of make sure I knew what story I wanted to tell. And then I went and met with Paul Whitman, and we walked the story. So everywhere Bill Calhoun went, I went. Everywhere Tony Lopez went, I went. And I tried to walk as much of their life on Corregidor as I could. But to me, I agree with you. It's essential. Because I was sort of raised in a newsroom, I was raised to go get the story on the ground. I just don't know another way to do it.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that.
So, okay, so yes, this is a good picture here, right? So you can see that right there, Malenta Hill and the tunnels, and then the bottom side and top side you'll hear in throughout the book too. Top side being the top of the hill, that big tadpole head, and then bottom side being everything south of that. Well, it wouldn't be south, but you get the point. Now, the amphibious assault comes in. You see on that near side where it says bottom side. That's where the American amphibious assault comes in, and they come in right there, and then they take down Malenta Hill. And when you come in, when I came in to visit, I came in on the north dock. So we came into that north dock, and there's a resort right there in the middle on bottom side where you can stay. And I stayed there a week. We spent a week walking around. Which was awesome. It's really worth, if you really have an interest in Corregidor at all, it's worth, if you get to Manila, take that day. Even the day trip is worth the effort. It's a nice boat ride out there. You get good lunch. You get a chance to see all of the island. You get to see all the high points. And if you read the book, you'll know what you're looking at. So it's really worth it. But if you get more days, like the one nice thing about touring Corregidor now is you can do it pretty much Indiana Jones, where they'll let you crawl through stuff. So I just basically got a water, got a pack on, and we just went all over crawled all over. One thing I'll make one more comment as we go through, because you'll start to see period pictures coming in. I want you all to notice that it's jungly and green right now. It wasn't when they jumped.
Yeah. Okay.
A lot of this, it was a different battlefield than the one. So a lot of the stuff that I saw is overgrown. It's jungle fighting. There was some in the ravines that you'll see off the top, but when they jump on top of Corregidor, it's not like you're going to see here. All right, now we get our guy, Panama Jones, Colonel George Jones, West Point grad, veteran, one of the first early officers in the American Airborne. And he started as a battalion commander out in Panama. And then he joins the 503rd as they head out to the Pacific to be MacArthur's strategic reserve. And then he eventually takes over the whole regiment. He was known as Panama Jones. That was the nickname. There was another nickname too about he locked a bunch of officers up, and they called him the warden after they got disciplined. And he had a tendency to steal the best cigarettes from the ration packs from his officers. He'd trade them, but you don't really trade with the commander. But Jones was a really good parachute commander. He was a good airborne guy, and I think he embodied that sort of airborne leadership. We were talking about earlier about the 101st getting a lot of credit for Bastogne, right? And they drove in by truck. What I think what I like to point out, and I think the Marines have the same sensibility even to the modern day, which is that, and if you notice in Kabul now, currently it's the 82nd and the Marines that are there. And they do that because there's something about a paratrooper that you can tell a man, we'll give you 2 days worth of food, 2 days worth of ammunition, and we'll kick you out of a plane into the middle of the enemy, and you're going to survive. And you're not only going to survive, you're going to win. And so I think that mentality and I think George Jones kind of gets that mentality. There's a part in the book where early in the battle, the Japanese defenders rally and do a bonsai assault, and they break through, and they were dang close to kicking the paratroopers back off of the high ground. And George Jones, towards the end of it, is helping to defend his headquarters with his sidearm. So he was well respected. I think one of his regrets, from what I was told by some of the veterans, one of his regrets is that he held back a lot of the awards that guys were nominated for and put in for, because he still had this distinction between the citizen soldier and the professional soldier, and he was a professional soldier, and he just didn't think that the citizen soldier cared as much about the awards. And you find that with the fight that Calhoun, who comes up, and we'll see him later, has to do to get Lloyd MacArthur his medal.
But that's quite common, though, isn't it? With some of the airborne commanders, there was a sense amongst them that you're getting the extra pay for jumping out of an aircraft. You've already got the boots. You've already got that. Don't give them too much, because you're right that the paratrooper mentality, whether they're American, British, Canadian, German, or Japanese, is that you're the best, and you've got this ability to. You're not. You're meant to be surrounded. You're meant to be outnumbered. Then it's just water off a duck's back. But you can be. In a sense, the opposite of that is you can be too cocky, too arrogant, too much belief. So, I can understand, although I don't necessarily agree with it, why some airborne commanders kind of restricted the medals, because they don't want these guys getting to be so confident that they become, foolish or disregard the dangers. It's a fine balance. And in reading your book, it seems to me he embodies that ability to get on with the guys junior to him, which is important for an airborne commander, because there's much more proximity between you and the men than there is in an infantry division. But also he seems to be able to understand the higher level of operational planning as well. So he's got that kind of, I would say, James Gavin ability to kind of work at both ends, which is obviously a skill. But yeah, and it's my takeaway reading the book is why his name doesn't come up in that list of legendary airborne commanders from World War II. He should be in the top 10, if not in the top 5. But for whatever reason, the Pacific Campaign, he's just not in that league.
He doesn't get the credit he deserves. And it's interesting, you bring up Gavin, you got Ridgway, what's the 82nd commander? John Wayne played him in The Longest Day.
Vandervoort, yeah.
Vandervoort, yeah. I mean, these are guys that the Airborne knows. And what I think people need to remember too is that if you were an airborne officer in World War II, you went through Fort Bragg, you went through Camp McCall, and so they all came from the same spot. They all sort of kind of that culture, I think, permeates no matter if you're on the Pacific or the European side of the war.
No, I agree, and they seem to have the slight renegade quality as well, because airborne forces was so new. I mean, when you were embedded in modern wars, being airborne is a completely understood as an integral part of how our military functions, and being ranger tabs and airborne. But back in World War II, of course, airborne was new, and to prosper in it, you kind of had to almost abandon a regular career, because the hierarchy of the military didn't really like these newfangled guys who got more money and were jumping out of aircraft and costing a lot of money. I mean, that's the budget to train up a PIR was much higher than training up an infantry regiment, and so the army's kind of not working against the airborne concept, but they're not necessarily supporting it. So I think that the commanders that prosper have this ability to kind of rise above that not prejudice, but reluctance from the army is showing towards this new arm.
I mean, the other also thing too is like traditional battles start with all the units are together at one, and then they move into the battle space, and then make first contact, and then it gets a little crazy, right? Where the kind of the airborne mentality is we're just going to throw all of our guys at you, and then we're going to come together slowly into then we build the formations that way. And I think that also, anytime you take, and when you see it also when the special forces come about, or when the Navy SEALs come about, or any of the Rangers even, anytime you take, especially on a big organization like the military, and you flip the paradigm, or you change the way that we're thinking about war, the traditionalists are going to push you back. They're just not as keen on that. But I think you got to credit the airborne forces of World War II for what we have now, and the reason why there are still airborne in 2021.
Yeah, absolutely. Those forerunners that paved the way, and that are quite right. People like Bill Lee, of course, ended up losing the 101st. Is many ways the father of the airborne, and those early guys putting the American football helmets on and jumping out of whatever aircraft they could borrow in whatever gear they could beg, borrow, or steal. And the same with the British airborne forces. They are the pioneers of what is now accepted as an integral part of a military, and all the special forces that have evolved from it. So it's important. But anyway, I'm digressing from George.
No problem. So yeah, that's George, and he's sort of the guy in charge. Okay, here's the plan. So let me walk you through the plan. And this is kind of a really I don't think that this plan gets enough credit for what it is, in that it is truly just imagine how hard it is to have pulled this off, in that you're going to have, so if you look at the parachute icon there, if you look at that pirate parachute icon right there, you've got to think there's going to be two C-47s flying in at the same time. One of them is going to peel to the left, and one of them is going to peel to the right, and they're going to run racetracks, and they're going to do 2 drops before they exit. And so imagine, I mean, the fact they didn't crash 2 planes together is shocking to me. Okay. But what makes this plan so interesting is that the 2 drop zones, one is the parade field, which is, if you're looking at that icon and you see that long building it's like a long building with a little, there it is right there. That's mile long barracks. If you see that barracks, to the left of that barracks is the drop zone. That's the parade field where one of the groups drops, and the other one is down here, this other box here, and that's a 9-hole golf course. It's a par 3 golf course. So when you think about the D-Day drops and those big drops into Normandy, and then really into Market Garden, where they were daylight drops on big fields, this is a postage stamp drop. They were 350 feet. I mean, they got out of the door, and then they had a second to figure out what was going on, and then boom, the parachute was up. They didn't have any time because of a crosswind that was going across the top that was going to push them off into the bay. So when they go to jump here, you had American patrol craft all around to pick guys up. The Japanese were still thinking that there was amphibious. They had been warned about a possible airborne drop, but they were still thinking that it was going to be an amphibious assault. So the aircraft come in and they make these racetracks. They drop two battalions out of the three. The third one comes in later, and as they're dropping the first wave, after the first wave drops and they go back to pick up the second wave, the amphibious assault starts as well. So at that point, that you've got fighting. If you're the Japanese defenders, you've got fighting on the top of Corregidor that you're trying to figure out what's going on. You're also seeing that there's an amphibious assault right there at the south dock, and they're starting to flow in that way. The paratroopers were there to try to cover some of those assault beaches as those guys were coming in, and the 34th Infantry is bringing in the heavier equipment.
And there's naval support and air support as well. And it's interesting that this show is following Crete yesterday, because that all went to pot in Crete. Particularly the second jump the Germans did there is that the fighter support had gone in way earlier. So instead of it being at the same time, the Germans had recovered from that. And this is one of those, like all airborne plans, it relies on all the elements working at the same time. Otherwise, you end up alerted. If one bit happens too early, you alert the defenders. So who was in overall command? Because it's amphibious, airborne, naval support, airstrike. Who's the master plan at the top?
This is Jones's show. This is the task force that he oversees, and then they eventually take the name, the Rock Force. It becomes their sort of mantra because of how well this was pulled off. The 503rd, I actually saw the 503rd when I was in Iraq early in the war. They were there. They're part of the 173rd Airborne Brigade now, and I remember seeing those patches and hearing them talk about they're the Rock guys.
And how long did it take to plan? By the way, was it hastily put together?
Yeah, it was pretty quick. They got the mission. See, the 503rd thought they were going to Manila to help during the Battle of Manila, and then MacArthur the whole time had them slotted for this on the side, and so Jones gets the mission. He takes a reconnaissance flight and then comes back and says, "Hey, I'm going to jump on that airfield at the tail," and the commander's like, "No, you're not." And I forgot the general's name. I apologize, guys. It's been a while, but the general in charge was one of MacArthur's main tactical guys, and he says, "No, you're jumping on top of the island," and so that's where they jump on up. So I would say, I think it was 10. I should really have this. I think it was 10 days or so, maybe a week before they jumped, and they did a lot of reconnaissance flights. They were doing a lot of bombing runs, and they had estimated it was a couple hundred guys on there because they just didn't see a lot of guys. What they realized is that there were a whole lot more Japanese. There were, I had that number here. So the 6th Army was in charge. They estimated 850 defenders. The 503rd, their intelligence shop, because they were getting messages from the resistance who was watching the island that they were seeing supply ships, and they estimated about 1,400, but the actual manpower was about 6,000 defenders. Yeah. And so they're outnumbered because there was about 3,000 paratroopers.
Yeah, and that's airborne forces. You're used to being underarmed because you've only got what you're jumping out with, but outnumbered as well is not an ideal situation. And for this part of the war, Kevin, as well, is that the Allies aren't really mounting things unless we outnumber the enemy 3-1, because we've got. Right. Finally, after 5 years of fighting, we've got that strength in the depth that we didn't have earlier in the war, when every time we mount an operation, we're using every single landing craft we've got, we're using every single aircraft we've got. By 45, we can mount multiple operations almost on the same day because there's material arriving from the USA on an almost daily basis, almost too much stuff. I mean, when I had Ian W. Toll, and he talked about 200,000 American troops on Saipan and Guam. By this point, it's insane the number of the amount of resources the USA has at its disposal at this point as well. And yet, bizarrely, it still comes down to sending in paratroopers to get boots on the ground, because you can't use this almighty Pacific fleet that's behind you. You still can't take it. And I also think we ought to mention as well that whether or not Corregidor was important strategically, and it was, but MacArthur was always going to want to go there. MacArthur, because of leaving there in 41, there was no way, even if the Japanese had left, he wasn't going to have a force go back there and have that symbolic moment there. I mean, because MacArthur does like that PR kind of side of things, isn't it? So there was always that personal aspect of him in the Philippines that was always going to come into play, I think.
He was never going to starve this out. He just wasn't.
Yeah.
And you know, there was some strategic importance to it, but at the end of the day, in 41, when he has to evacuate and when it falls and Wainwright is taken prisoner and everybody's convinced that the Japanese, like the Germans, are invincible, that was a mark on the American army, and he was going to get that back. And I don't think he makes any bones about it. And I think that whole argument on was it worth it or you know, should we have done it? I mean, to the men who jumped on Corregidor, this was a big deal. This was an honorable mission. This was one that if they couldn't go to Manila, they wanted this one, and this was a big deal for them. And they you know, I got a sense from the research, but also from interviewing one of the veterans that jumped on this, that you know, this was one of their honors. It was an honor to get this mission and to take this ground back. I mean, it was sacred ground for them.
And absolutely. And if you're a paratrooper, you want to jump. You want to jump into something. You want that mission that people go, wow. You don't want to be, you know, guarding prisoners of war or doing some trudge through some. You want to be doing what you've trained for. That's the whole reason for earning the wings is to go out there and prove your mettle. And this is an opportunity to do that. And you know, okay, the odds may be stacked against you. There may be a dangerous enemy, but you know, paratroopers don't shy away from that. That's their reason for existing.
Exactly. I mean, look at the mustard stains is what they call them, right? On your wings. Every time you get a combat jump, you get the little gold star on there.
Yeah.
I mean, those are badges of honor. I mean, even to today, if you can get one of those, and they're rare now. They weren't as rare, you know, after World War II, but they're rare now. You know, it's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about some of the men.
Okay, so I did this where I tried to find people that you could follow, and so I was lucky enough to find Bill Calhoun and his family. Paul Whitman had known him well, the historian from Australia, and he had an unpublished manuscript that laid out this mission and laid out his career as a platoon leader in an F Company of the 503rd. And so I was lucky to get it, and it gave me that through line. And so that's why you get this insightful perspective of what happened during that mission. And that's why you know what he prayed after he gets ambushed in one of the ravines, because he wrote it and he wrote it down. Bill Calhoun is essentially, for those who have read Band of Brothers, he's Dick Winters in this. He's the guy that wants that, you know, he's the leader that everybody wants to follow. He's the guy that cares about his men. And you know, I like, he's got a great kind of upbringing. He's got kind of that Texas swagger that you kind of look for in someone you want to write about. And so he really is the sort of the heart and soul of the book. And I was really honored to have met him. I got to sit in his car. His daughter still has his car, so I got to sit in his car. And she trusted me with this manuscript and let me try to tell his story. And
those magic words of unpublished manuscript that every researcher wants to find. It's that eureka moment. You're starting your book, and then there's an unpublished manuscript. It's that thank you for that. That's that. You can't go wrong when you get that kind of raw material, first person, primary sources. Fantastic stuff.
Yeah, no, I was really lucky. And what's funny is there was I got the one version from his daughter that was still on dot matrix printer paper with his handwritten notes on it. And then Paul Whitman had another version that he had done edits and done some polishing on. And so I was able to merge both of those and be able to kind of, Paul had helped correct, you know, memory is fungible. So like,
dates and directions can often fall around, and that, you know, the distances I always find it's a veteran we've had this discussion on World War II numerous times. They'll never forget the emotion. They'll never forget those key moments of personal crises, but they may say it's Tuesday when it was a Thursday. They may say a mile away when it was 200 yards away, because of that, as you know, because you've been in the war zones, that time, you lose track of time when you're there, distance, when you're crawling on your belly, it seems like a mile. You go back there and you realize it was 200 yards. That kind of thing it needs that double checking, doesn't it? Always.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so Charlie Bradford becomes really, he's important. Now, he's an interesting cat because he is a doctor. He's initially not in the 503rd, and he's treating a lot of injuries as they're practicing in Australia. And so he sort of figures out that they may need a battalion surgeon to help patch these guys up. So Charlie Bradford's an important person in this book because he gives you a wider perspective. He allowed me to open the aperture a little bit and get it outside of Calhoun and F Company and see a little bit more of the battle, because the aid station's at Mile Long Barracks, and he picks up stories as they come in and out of the aid station. And so he allowed us to see the bigger battle, but he also was a key. He had another unpublished manuscript. Now, it was unpublished in that a lot of the previous authors who had worked on this battle had used this manuscript. It was sort of unpublished only in that he didn't want to publish it officially, but he had passed it around. So it had been passed around a little bit. And luckily for me, he was an amazing writer, and he's really insightful. And he took the time to really capture not only he had a good sense of not only the moment he was in, but also what that moment meant. And so there's a couple really great scenes that he was able to bring to the book, particularly around like the end with MacArthur and that ceremony, and then some of how the guys changed during the course of the battle. And then he's got that really great scene, that great chapter where he goes on patrol and goes all the way down and gets into one of the nastier fights towards the bottom of one of the ravines. But he's also the everyman, right? So he's not a combatant. So he gives you that sense from the reader of being in and around the battle without having to empathize with someone who has to then, fire a weapon.
Yeah, and a surgeon, of course, is always going to measure things in lives and the effect on human beings, where some commanders are measuring it in terms of objectives and mission success, which is, of course, is integral to understanding how the operation unfolds. But the human cost is also needs to be inserted to balance out we've gained this, because gaining something always comes at a human cost. And as I said before we went live, I really enjoyed your book because it had that classic combination of making me understand where I was in the battle, but also understanding how it was affecting the people, because sometimes the early histories can be very dry. It becomes like a cricket score, gained this, lost that, and you don't get that sense of what it's meaning to the guys.
Right. I always say, like, you could write, Alpha Company is, hit the right flank and got around. And that's one thing, right? Or you could say, well, what was it like to be the point man in Alpha Company? Like, he's sweating, he's sweating, he's scared. Every noise, is important to him. And then that's where I feel like that's where I like to live. I like to live with the point man and less about, hey, this was the strategy.
I mean, it's, you said, the people, if they want that overall picture, they can go and get those official US Army green books and look at all the maps and understand 5th Corps, 6th Corps, 7th Corps, and follow all that if they want to. But I don't personally like too much of that in a book, because I just find it takes me out of the moment too much. I mean, I need to understand it, but it's about balance, isn't it? It's about, like these shows, it's about, where do you pitch the level of detail. But I'm thoroughly enjoying this, by the way. So that's Bradford. Tony Lopez was my hero in the reading the book, I have to confess.
Oh, Tony! I love Tony Lopez because I got to meet Tony Lopez right before he passed away. I went to Denver and sat down with him for that afternoon and talked about the story, the story and his time there. He's got a little shorter stint in Corregidor. For those who haven't read it, I won't spoil it. But Tony Lopez is a hero. But he is the definition of a hero. He does some things in this battle that I can't imagine. But what I loved about Tony Lopez is what I love about talking to all the veterans is I loved hearing the story, the funny stories, the story where he bakes the pies. I love listening to him talk about how they used to rob all the other units blind. I liked how if you left a Jeep anywhere near the 503rd, it was gone. They'd steal it. I love the end where he talks about his friend spinning the revolver around and shooting himself by accident. Those are the stories to me that bring such humanity to something that's so inhumane. And so I cherished that moment I got to hang out with him, and his family's been gracious. And again, most of the great reviews I've gotten really come from the families that when they read it, they thought I did a good job capturing it. And that to me means more than anything.
Yeah, that's always that. Anyone who, like myself, who's done a military book, if the families of those you write about love it, if no one else buys it, who cares? If those people that you're actually honoring in the book like it, job done. Walk away. Anyone else is a bonus. I always think in that sense. If you're pleasing the guys that were there, and if you're carrying on your Dick Winters and as he's maybe the Bill Garnier, possibly. I don't know. It's like I don't know.
I mean, if you want to, we can run that one. Yeah, I think he very much is, and I think he's very. He's got a couple really important parts of the book that I think give you a sense of not only the heroism that I think was inherent in this battle, but I also think he's got an interesting parachute landing, and then what he ends up doing when it matters to go down and put himself in harm's way, I think speaks to just his character, but I think it also widely speaks to sort of the culture that the 503rd and the way that they all band together. So definitely big fan. All right, so Lloyd MacArthur, I love Lloyd MacArthur. I really wanted to write much more about Lloyd MacArthur. Lloyd MacArthur to me is if I came up with Lloyd and said, I'm going to write a book, and one of the characters is a lumberjack from Idaho, older guy. He was in his mid-20s, which made him an old man, who seemed to only be comfortable in combat. He was the quintessential soldier and was very bad at being around the flagpole.
Earl McClung. He's the Earl McClung. I'm going with this band of brothers. He's the Earl McClung now.
Right. I love it. All right. So and so I tried to do a lot of research. I tried to get as much as I can on Lloyd MacArthur. Wanted to write much more about him. And I found not as much as I wanted. And I almost feel like it's better that you don't have the whole inner monologue with him. I think the fact that even his unit mates see him as what he is, as this he was, I want to say bigger than life, but he
enigmatic, maybe kind of. Yeah.
The fact that Calhoun would go to the brig and get him out of the brig so that because he wasn't going to Corregidor without Lloyd MacArthur, I think speaks to his skill set, but also speaks to sort of this lucky charm. They felt most comfortable when he was in the front kind of thing. And then his action during the Night of 1,000 Hours, which is what they called it, the bonsai attack, is I found the hole where he was hiding and fighting the Japanese from, and it's Lloyd MacArthur is I don't know, is what you make legends out of, and I really
you do it in your book that without actually overtly saying it, that importance, particularly in an airborne unit, of that bond within a squad, within a platoon, with a company, because you are absolutely dependent on the guy to your left and right. You are in the regular infantry as well. You are in the combat engineers, but there's a sense of isolation in the airborne where you absolutely have to depend on that guy. And there's a lot of the airborne guys I know from different eras. There's lots of kind of superstitions and luck and jinxes and stuff involved, and if there's a talisman within a platoon or a section and he's not there, you can feel that the whole company is or unit is sort of suffering in some way. They build a lot in that, having the team that they know around them, because they've spent so much time training, living with each other. Because that's the thing about airborne forces. They're generally a lot longer in training and a lot less time in combat. It's a sort of sweeping statement because they're refining and honing all the time. So that need to rely on that person beside you, I think, is something that comes across in all good airborne books. You've got to get across that camaraderie, that very base level love they have for each other.
Yeah, and it goes back to that goes back to what we talked about before too, which is like onesies and twosies turn into 5, turn into 10, turn into a platoon, a company, blah blah. It's mixed. I think that's part of it too, is that they really need to rely on their own skill set, but they also need to rely on their friends.
Yeah,
to make sure.
And we've just got a couple of questions coming in. Generally, they're coming at the same time about the previous experience of the 503rd, Jones himself, but also the unit. I mean, are they all kind of at the same level of experience, or is there variety?
There's a variety. They'd had some combat jumps already. And they had seen combat. They did a seaborne assault right before this. They met very little resistance, but so they weren't new, and this wasn't a new thing for them. They had some experience doing it.
Cool. Great stuff. So now we're talking about the jump itself, and this is a great one to convey what you were saying earlier about the difference in foliage. The terrain is exactly the same, but the actual what you see on the ground is very different. In fact, some of those black and white photos, it almost looks like it's kind of North Africa or the Mediterranean somewhere, because it's dusty. It's not like some photos like New Guinea, where you just get that sense of oppressive jungle. Corregidor, the photos, it looks very not deserty, but it looks more like a rock environment, hence the nickname, rather than this kind of jungle, humid kind of image we have from the aerial photos, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, and that's why I pointed that out. I mean, if you can see here, and those white specks are parachutes. So this is the second. Yeah. This is the second guys coming in, and what I think you notice is like just what you said. It's rocks. This is not jungle fighting that I think people expected it to be. It's very much. It's almost post-apocalyptic, and when you see some of the footage soon, you'll see like the busted trees, and so imagine though that you're jumping basically into a field of craters with rebar, with broken trees. So a lot of the injuries that these guys suffered were from, landing on, a very jagged, very terrible drop zone. Oh, cool. All right. So yeah, watch this jump. This is kind of cool.
And there's, by the way, folks, there's lots of stuff on YouTube about Corregidor. I shorten these clips just to make them mad. There's quite a few. There's a Pathé one from Britain. There's maybe 20 minutes worth of stuff from just the parachute jump. Then there's stuff later on about MacArthur. So there's quite a lot of resources out there. But yeah, it's the precision of the jump. It looks like in this footage, it looks like a training jump. I mean, I know that, as you'll say, that they would explain that it wasn't a perfect jump, but and the crosswinds. Talk about the weather conditions they're facing.
Well, they're facing a crosswind, because it almost gets scrubbed because of it, and that crosswind would push them off the cliff and into the water. So their biggest fear was they didn't want to get pushed into the ravines, because they knew that's where the Japanese defenders were, and so they wanted to land on top in that open area. And so that's where, and there's a great sequence where you'll see Calhoun is one of the jump masters, and he was very good at getting his guys out, but he's more stressed about getting his guys onto the drop zone than he is actually being into combat. But yeah, if you can see here, I mean, they're spitting these guys out in small sticks. A stick is a group of paratroopers when they jump, and they had to cut down the number of guys that they would normally do in half so they could get the drop zone was so short and they were over it so quickly that they could only do. That's why they had to make multiple passes. So yeah, here they are just crashing down. And so imagine though, you've landed now with this like that up. That's an important, that guy, that's Chet Nycum. If you see that guy right there, that's Chet Nycum. And he's in the book as well. Pennsylvania guy. He's a scout in G Company. Chet was I think he was sort of sore at the fact that he was always, forever remembered by the guy that goes crashing into that crater. But imagine at this point, though, you're also looking at it where you've landed, you're gathering up your guys and you're headed towards your objective, but you've got to dodge guys coming, falling all around you. There's a nice sequence in the book too, where Bradford is running to the barracks to set up the aid station, and he's dodging things, equipment and men coming down.
And there again, you can see the confining nature of that drop zone. Okay, that's a modern photo. Thanks, Tone, again with the jungle more in place. But to think, those who understand parachuting, to understand that you're reducing the stick size because you just haven't got enough flight time over the drop zone. When you're talking at previous operations in World War II, you got a drop zone of 3 or 4 miles across, and even if you miss it, there's fields to the left, fields to the right, fields to the north and south. I know there's other perils with other jumps, but this is precision stuff. And if it goes wrong, it goes badly wrong. And mercifully, if I remember correctly from your book, no one actually did land in the sea, although there were. Am I right in remembering it that?
I think there's a couple of guys that land in the sea.
Okay.
20 guys were killed on the jump.
And here's another bit of footage, and it's and you can, by the way, folks, you could see that mile-long building was as it's known in the footage there. And this bit I downloaded and I cleaned up a little bit because it was very bad contrast, so I darkened it a little bit to make it a bit clearer. But yeah, and what was the feeling about the jump for those who were participating in it? Did they feel it went better than they were expecting it? Was it different experiences depending on where you landed?
Oh, by far. I mean, I think the commanders, if I remember correctly, they figured they'd lose 50% of the guys. And so the fact that I think it was like less than 10% jump injuries and only 20 killed. I mean, that they were ecstatic.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, and Tonne, our pilot who flies over there, you know, he'll tell you that flying over the Philippines today with winds and different, it's not easy. It's not, and that's just flying. It's not jumping out. You know, it's not the ideal place to necessarily jump in. But that's, I guess, it's the surprises on that the Japanese were expecting the amphibious bit first. The fact that they were coming in on this hill was to their advantage, Americans, because it was pretty much complete surprise. And on that subject, did the Japanese, did the Allies completely surprised, and they saw those aircraft and went, what the hell's happening? Or had they got any idea it was happening before then? Obviously the bombardment, they knew something was happening, but were they aware about it being an airborne drop?
They were aware that the Americans were coming. They weren't aware that the airborne drop. The airborne drop surprises them to the point where, oh, real quick, if you guys just check this full, I mean, that's what it looked like. You know, that's a different kind of look than what I was walking through and what you see in those green, and this is not the same, right? The Japanese were aware that the Americans were coming. They had been warned that an amphibious assault, or an airborne assault may be coming. The commander at the time didn't take a lot of. He didn't think it was true. And then when the jump starts, he comes running out of his command bunker to see what's going on. And a couple paratroopers who had missed the drop zone were in a ravine and they were working their way back up to the rendezvous, spotted him and killed him. So Lieutenant Endo ends up becoming the commander because I forgot, it was Captain, but I don't remember his name. He gets killed almost right at the start. And that derails the Japanese defense. It throws them into chaos. And then the Americans, by taking the top, they're able to cut communications and take over some of the command bunkers. And that cuts off the Japanese ability to coordinate their attack for a day or two before Lieutenant Endo then amasses his forces for the Banzai assault.
Yeah. And again, this footage is just incredible. And yeah, folks, you can find lots of this online. It's just a very short clips there. And yeah, we'll move on. I'm just answering a couple of questions on there. But so, yeah, again, the terrain, it conveys it in that photo there. I mean, if you freeze frame that, you could think that was Greece or you know, it doesn't, to me, it doesn't say Philippines, that footage. I mean, we know it is, but yeah, this is what happens after days of bombardment, I guess.
Yeah. And look at that parachute swinging back and forth. Like, what's interesting too is, so you have all these parachutes all over. When I was there, Paul Whitman and I were over there by Mile Long Barracks, and he says, "Oh, watch this!" And he was digging in some of the rubble, and he pulled out a bunch of parachute soak. So wow. I got a little parachute soak from the jump, which I'm not sure we're supposed to take. So if you're on here and I'm not supposed to have taken that, sorry, I've got a little bit though. But yeah, so this is the. Yeah, this is here. You can see where the foliage is pretty much, you know, all burned out. So and it's dusty. The guys complain about the dust and everything too.
And I noticed in the footage as well a distinct lack of web gear. I mean, is it because they're anticipating a short, brief action? Because you know, we have images from other campaigns in ETO of the guys going in absolutely laden with more kit than they ever need. This seems to be a fairly stripped down. Is that because of the swiftness of the arrival of the amphibious troops, or is it being resupplied? Why are they so devoid of equipment?
I know they are getting a resupply. They're supposed to also get an aerial resupply. The only other thing, and that's a good question, I don't know for sure. The only other thing I can think of too is that they have taken most of their gear and ground it at their rendezvous, because they did quickly take some of the houses, and each of the companies had their own CP. And I know from experience, modern, you'll often, you know, you'll have those big packs, but you'll ground those packs. Maybe you'll bring an assault pack when you're actually on patrol, just to cut weight. And it was hot, and they just wanted to take what they essentially needed to do patrols initially, and to set the perimeter.
Because as we know, you said right at the beginning, the island it's only 4 miles long, so theoretically you're never really that far away from where you left off. And providing you know there's a support network worked up behind you with, you know, company headquarters, and you know where that mission can come from, you're not too far away from things, I suppose. I mean, it's, you know, as we know from Normandy, or, you know, people are landing 15 miles away from the drop zones, and Crete, as Greg talked about yesterday, much bigger. But anyway, so they've landed. So the jump was a lot less costly than they were anticipating in the worst case. But now they've got to set about going to their objectives. So we talked about earlier about these gun batteries that have been built there. So so they're moving basically down towards these objectives. So how many of the 503rd were they moving out in the right strength? Was there lots of scattering? Was it on schedule at this point? Give us an idea of kind of a timetable.
Yeah, I mean, the scattering wasn't like Normandy, right, where you had guys everywhere. I mean, it's much more of a market garden style jump where they were able to consolidate quickly. They were able to get their initial objectives quickly, and then they start that first day to set the perimeter and to patrol out so they can get enough green space in and around Mile Long Barracks. Mile Long Barracks is where the CP, the command post, is set up, as well as where the aid station is set up. So that really becomes the center of gravity for Jones and his staff, and then everybody else starts to operate. If you look across the parade ground, there's a series of houses there, and then that F company is in that last house headed, at the end here. So I think Jones was very happy with the initial first days, and I think it shows because he eventually pushes perimeter out too far, which is why the Banzai assault later in the battle almost is successful, because I think he got a little not complacent, but I think he got a little confident because of how well it was going, and he pushed his defensive line out too far.
So is where the Banzai charge kind of visible on that photo?
The Banzai charge comes if you see, let's see here, if you push, all right, if north is up, if you go northwest, it comes up here, and it comes up through this way. And that's where you're going to get the different batteries, and that's where you're going to get, that's where they come up.
There's another one there from, again, great photos. We're so grateful that our friends sent them. You can see the buildings there, and if you're there today, how much do you feel that you are visiting the World War II battlefield? I mean, you said there's the kind of resort down in the middle bit, but is this bit seemingly still quite authentic?
It is. It's really nice. I mean, you really feel like you're there. You can poke around in Mile Long Barracks. The white buildings here that you see are new modern buildings that were created. There's a museum. You can still get up to that lighthouse. That lighthouse is where right there, that white lighthouse there, that is authentic, and that's where Calhoun slept at one night. Wow. After they pull him out after the Banzai assault. Yeah, this is a good look at, like, this is what it, those are you can see the buildings there, and then you can see I think this is the 9-hole golf course, and you can see the parachutes right there.
I mean, they are almost inches apart, those parachutes. I mean, as you said earlier, it's great to have a compact landing like that, but it means the second you're landing, that the chances are another parachute is going to land on your head if you're not being aware. So there's benefits of landing in a tight space, and the negatives is that you've got to get all that coordination, and hats off to them for doing such a fantastic job. So this is another photo showing down the length of the tadpole there. So is that a good one to kind of explain the overall objectives?
So, all right. So look, this would be, you're higher than topside, but this would be on topside. If you're standing behind Mile Long Barracks, looking down the tail, right? Yeah. So that's where there's a scene in the book where Bradford's standing on top of the third floor of Mile Long Barracks, and he's watching the battle kind of unfold around him. And one of the places he's looking is down the tail. And he talks about some of the 30th Infantry guys coming out to Malinta Hill, trying to take the top of Malinta Hill. Because when they got to the top and dug the Japanese out of the top of Malinta Hill, they were, for the tunnels, they had exhaust pipes out of the top, and they would pour gas down those exhaust pipes and set them on fire. This is probably the nastiest battle I've ever covered. The things that both sides do in this battle, I mean, this is a fierce fight, and it's two armies that do not like each other, that will give no quarter to either one of them, locked on a small island. And there's a scene that ends with American paratroopers going into a bunker with trench knives and bayonets, and it's medieval almost, some of the battles in this. Yeah,
and that comes across in your book, and as we've talked about before, that there was a big discussion on Twitter a couple of days ago whether people prefer Band of Brothers or the Pacific as a series, and that it's the brutality of the Pacific is off-putting to some people, because you not only is the combat more gory and no holds barred, you don't get always those liberations, as we did the show with James M. Scott about Manila and the rampage, that there was no happy ending in the liberation of the Philippines. So everything just becomes more downbeat. Though there are these clear victories, they don't always feel like victories when you're there on the ground, because of the savage nature of what you've seen around you. And the Japanese are now the cornered animal because they know they're losing the war, and there's nothing more dangerous than a wounded animal that knows it's wounded, and they might as well go down in their blaze of glory. And the fact there's a Banzai charge, because we talked in earlier shows on this channel that the Banzai charges are very much a kind of a 42 kind of thing, aren't they? Then later in the war they kind of do wane a bit, but this point is this is a very a condensed battlefield, as you say, where a very good description of two enemy forces that just don't like each other and are going into this with essentially with no rule book. And how difficult is it just conveying that when you're writing about that? When do you decide how graphic to go in it? Do you find yourself struggling to get the balance right?
Yes and no. I tend to lean into it. I think it's a really, I think we do the veterans a disservice if we try to make World War II mythical. I think we don't allow them to be human, and we expect them to process the trauma that they had to endure. If we try to make them, if we try to do like it's The Longest Day versus Saving Private Ryan, right? Like The Longest Day, I watched as a kid. It's glorious, right? Omaha Beach is tough, but it's not Saving Private Ryan, right?
Yeah,
I tend to lean more towards Saving Private Ryan, because I think we do a disservice to veterans if we don't acknowledge that what they had to endure on our behalf was traumatic, and it's part of their psyche now forever. And that's where, so I lean into the gore, not to entertain, but to say, look, this is not a battle that you want to play in the backyard. This is this was a ferocious, nasty battle on both sides. I was really hoping to try to get a Japanese perspective in this, and I was able to find a Japanese researcher was able to find one short narrative, because if you think about the casualties, the U.S. loses 207 guys, 684 are wounded. The Japanese, so we had out of 6,000, we had more than 6,000, probably close to 6,500 in defenders. It was more than 6,500 because they lose 6,000 guys. There was only 19 POWs and 50 wounded. So if you were Japanese in this fight and you got caught, you were dead. And so, so I was able to capture a little of that from this one narrative, and I think it's telling. I think there's something to be said about that. The fact that if you were a Japanese, rank and file soldier, they're known for being these tenacious attackers, the tenacious defenders will die to the last man. I think that part of that has to do with that Bushido officer code that, either I get killed by the Americans or I get killed by this guy.
Yeah. So, when you're covering the stories of these guys we talked about, and Lopez and others, and do you, because it's a relatively short battle compared to some other airborne engagements of World War II. In Normandy, famously, the 6th Airborne are there sitting on that ridge for 3 months. It's not quite the same intensity towards the end of the 3 months it was in the first few days, but they're there for a long time. But did you sense that over these few days, these guys are going from kind of enthusiastic about the operation to bloodied, beaten bastards, in a sense, to borrow a bit from Baston there, because of the brutality of this? The drop off in morale must have been quite sudden there, having to winkle out the Japanese in these, as we know from Okinawa and the other islands at the same time. It must have been, strength sapping and morale sapping. How did the guys in the 503rd deal with that endless, just one more cave, one more outpost?
I get a sense from Calhoun there's a weariness as the battle goes on. There's a weariness the way he writes about it. There's a questioning of the cost versus benefit of it. But then on the flip side, there's a part where the Japanese have been hoarding things out of Manila, and they were storing a lot of it on Corregidor, liquor, clothing. And so there's one part where a bunch of the paratroopers find a stash of clothing, and so Calhoun and his platoon go on patrol, but they're all dressed in civilian clothing. I think Calhoun was wearing yellow pants, and he gets caught by the battalion staff who chew his ass for it. But that to me is a good example of how guys in those kind of stressful situations will find the humanity or the joy in just that little moment of taking off that blood-soaked, sweat-soaked fatigue and putting on, a garish shirt and yellow pants and going on patrol seemed, because that was towards the end of the battle when it wasn't nearly as treacherous. But, I think that the morale does dip. I think anytime you're in concentrated combat like that, no matter what unit you're in, it falls on the leaders to rally their guys and to keep them focused. And I think it's those private moments, which is why I love that Calhoun manuscript, because you get that inner turmoil that he has. And you even get it when they leave. When he leaves Corregidor to go on to the rest of the war, when he's sitting on the back of that LST leaving, and he looks back at Corregidor. I mean, he asked the question in the book, and he's what did we do this for? Like, what did we really accomplish? And I think that's very telling. And I like that so much about this, because I think so much of what we talked about before about World War II is very mythical, and everybody was all in, and nobody ever questioned what they were doing. I think that does us disservice.
And I think to elaborate on that is that following this battle, these guys are going back to seeing this massive great fleet and these massive great resources and thinking, we've got all this, and yet we still have to fight across, hacking our way through a rock and foliage to winkle out Japanese. Because at this point, the war, once you kind of begin 1945, even halfway through 1944, the writing's on the wall. The Allies are going to win this war. It's a matter of we have this overwhelming strength now. And it's not the desperate times of Guadalcanal again. It's not when the war is in the balance. There is really no doubt now, and yet it still comes down, as you know from your experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, to the boots on the ground. It doesn't matter how many billion-dollar jets you've got flying, however far up, stealth fighters and stuff. I don't know that stuff, but some poor sod has to walk through a rubble festoon town with a backpack on his back, thirsty, and clear it with that rifle, and that has never changed. And this is what, to me, what the 503rd they represent, is that this might, we've got this, while this is going on, the Allies are refining the atomic bomb. They're refining this technology that is going to eventually bring an end to the war. But yet it still comes down to guys jumping on a drop zone a few hundred yards long and fighting their way across a 4-mile rock, inch by inch. That's why these books are important, because the Pacific, we talked about it, the Ian W. Toll's fantastic trilogy of books about the Pacific, when it's fleets and ships and armadas, and of course he includes personal stories in it as well, but it's so massive, you do lose a bit of that kind of the fact it's human beings, because a fleet becomes machinery, and your book and the 503rd struggle there is about individuals, and that's the takeaway, I think. So run us through just sort of the fight, that how those days panned out, and the losses. I think you already said them, but just remind ourselves what
the losses were. 207, 684 wounded. The battle kind of plays out where things look good. They push out the perimeter, and then the Lieutenant Endo, the Japanese commander, rallies his forces. He makes a big banzai assault, almost breaks through, almost sweeps them off of the top high ground. Americans are able to hold, and in doing so, Lieutenant Endo basically has very little left to defend with, and then it becomes what you're seeing here, which is a slog from tunnel to tunnel, ravine to ravine, as they slowly but surely clear the island, until finally MacArthur shows up, and he does a tour. He goes back to his old house. he makes an interesting comment about when he's looking at some of the big coastal guns about how the idea of fixed fortifications are no longer relevant anymore in modern war. He heaps a ton of praise on the paratroopers. George Jones is awarded, I think, Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership in this thing. And then they pack it up. The 503rd gets in on some ships, and they head out to. They're going out to another island in the Philippines to help fight there. And what they find later is there's still Japanese on the island at the end of the war. They don't come out for a long time. And they stay hidden. But at the end of the day, I think this is a battle that MacArthur took personally. I think the guys who were asked to do it knew it and took great pride in taking back what I think the American military at the time considered sacred ground.
I concur there. There was a big debate on Twitter today about whether or not taking Paris was strategically important for Allies, and I would argue it wasn't strategically important, but it was incredibly important to the people of France. It was incredibly important to people around the world that you've kind of got this liberation of a famous city, the City of Light, and sometimes you can argue that it doesn't have to be militarily important to be important. There's important in many things. And for MacArthur and those guys that escaped with him in 1941, the getting back to Corregidor and getting back to the Philippines was such an important message to the people back home as well, like Stilwell, in Burma. You've made promises. If you don't fulfill those promises, there's no closure. There's no completion of the plan, and I think that's very important. And to wind things up, we will talk about the fact that the legacies. So you said most people can talk about the 101st and where they were, the 82nd, and perhaps the British 1st Airborne Division, but I think a lot of people watching this don't. The 503rd wouldn't be an airborne unit. They could necessarily name, but yet they've done a lot, haven't they? So how important, I think you already said that, but how important is Corregidor to the young men who are in the 503rd today?
I mean, it's the defining sort of battle for this unit. And this patch that you see here is the modern version of it, but that patch was created right after the Battle of Corregidor. I forgot the name of the guy who came up with this patch. And it became, they accepted it as their patch. And I think, I think the 173rd looks back at their battles, and I don't care if you're a 173rd veteran from Iraq, Afghanistan, or Vietnam, you look back at those guys that jumped on Corregidor, and those are the founding fathers that put this unit on the map. And I think that's what I thought was so cool. The lineage reaches all the way back. And so, I run into these guys in Baghdad. I take a cursory little look at this Corregidor, not knowing that, years later, I would actually try to write maybe one of the books about it that folks will read.
And your book, I'm saying this entirely complimentary, is a celebratory book about units. There are some books that are very trying to have a go at this commander and say, emphasize the failures and the lessons that should have been learned. And of course, you can always, every battle in World War II, you can always analyze and say, well, that could have been improved by doing that. And maybe if we'd done this, that's the counterfactual side of it. But I think I do like a good, honest book sometimes that just is out there to celebrate what these guys did and say, they're if you're fighting as Lopez was across that island and you're not responsible for any errors that are happening at a high level or any strategic decision making. You're just doing your bit there. And I think those kind of books are very good and honest. And I think folks, I was going to finish by asking Kevin essentially what you thought about what's going on currently in Afghanistan, because I've been carrying on with my channel, and the news these last couple of weeks has been a pretty horrendous. But you've been out there, and I'm always aware that having not been to Afghanistan, having not been to that part of the world, that anything I say about it is clouded by the fact I don't really know what I'm fucking talking about. And my friends out there, I'm thinking of Pete Cosgrove, who was blown up there in Afghanistan a few years ago and is still kind of getting better from that. How he did a big emotional post on Facebook a few days ago, my friend, about what it means to him and the buddies he lost out there. So where are your thoughts right now with what's happening there, without getting too political? But I'd had to ask you.
Well, my thoughts really are grounded in what you said before too, which is, I've always tried to report from the soldier's point of view. I always liked Ernie Pyle, the way that he tried to get to the soldier, the human. I was far more interested in the sergeant or the corporal or the specialist than I ever was the general. And so for me, the war was not going to end with another troop surge. So the war was going to end probably poorly. But my heart goes out to the Afghans, the guys I know. I've been working with folks trying to help what I can to get people evacuated and connect them to what resources I can. So it breaks my heart to see what's happening. It breaks my heart to see that for folks who aren't going to get out of Afghanistan, that they're going to, I'm not convinced we're going to get Taliban 2.0, this kinder, gentler Taliban. And so I feel for the people and I feel for that country. Afghanistan is probably one of my favorite places in the whole world. I love the people there. I love the country. I love just everything about it. I love going there because I always leave feeling so much better. And so it breaks my heart that a country that deserves so much more is just going to not get it. And it's going to continue to not get it. And I don't, we can debate the politics of it. And I'm sure there, but at the end of the day, there isn't one president that lost this war for us. There isn't probably one prime minister that lost this war for the British. This was a bunch of errors that have compounded over 20 years. It's a tragedy. And I don't know how they have an uptick. There's no but it's just that's how
I'm with you, and I think I don't want to. When I'm reading the comments on social media, and one side, each side is blaming the president of their choice, and in Britain, I think it's overshadowing the human suffering. It's overshadowing, as you say, the people in Afghanistan, the servicemen who've been out there, the journalists, all that kind of support infrastructure that's been desperately there, trying to bring something to that area that we know has been fought over for millennia, essentially. And my friend Peter, who was in the Royal Tank Regiment, when he was out there, he was literally reading a book about the British cavalry there in 18, whatever it was. And he said, take out the word horse and put armored car. And it's exactly the same. The villages were the same. The terrain was the same. The enemy was the same. The outcome was often the same. And I'm fearing that this politicizing of it and the blame, it doesn't matter now who. It does matter that there's people who maybe should have done better things, but what matters more importantly than that is the human suffering. And they're already debating in Britain, whether or not we should accept the refugees. And you just open your heart and be sympathetic is my feeling. It's just been a tragic situation, and I don't know many people who've really been there for real. So I always, as I said, I tend to shut up about it because I don't have enough frame of reference, and it's people like yourself and my other Aussie friend Warwick, who was a photojournalist out there for years. He's now in Los Angeles now, but I respect his opinion because he's lived there. He lived there for years. But if you haven't been there, it's very easy to just be drip fed whatever newspaper or TV news station you watch and take on their opinion. And it's the people who've been there, I think, that really matters.
Well, I will caution you, though, that I'm still a Westerner. I'm still an American, and I live there off and on, but I've never lived in long spouts. I don't speak the language well, so I don't truly understand it. I just know that for me, I always saw the humanity of it. I saw the beauty in it, and that's what I think makes me the saddest. We can't go back in time and change decisions that were made. If we could, there would be all kinds of decisions that are redone, right?
Well, indeed, yeah. Where do you start? If you go back, if you could go back in history and change things, there's a lot of things I would change.
You wouldn't have much of a show if we can go back in time and change a couple.
No, there'd be no
early in the 40s.
Avoid them at the beginning. Just nip it in the bud. Yeah, just someone go back and I don't know, get Hitler in a car accident in 1933 or something. But anyway, it's another counterfactual. But in terms of what your the show, you're returning to World War II in the future with another book. What's your latest work?
I've got two. All right. So I just finished one. It'll be out in April. 100th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force. A guy named John Lucky Luckadoo, who did 25 missions over Germany, 43, 44. I'm working it so that you can interview him. I think that'd be awesome.
That'd be great.
He's a super good dude. He's 100 years old, lives in Dallas. and I wrote a book about his time there. And then I'm on the beginnings, and I'm going to hit you up with this later, but we'll just do it right here. I think I'm going to Normandy on the next one. That'll be the last one.
Oh, cool. Well, if you need a guy on the ground, you know
I do
where
need a
I
guy
am.
on the ground, and I will be there soon. I think I'm going to cover the 30th Infantry Division.
Oh, I think I've just fallen in love with you slightly now.
So I will be calling you, and we will be hanging out in person because I need some help.
Oh wow! No, that's the 30th are one of my unsung workhorses of the Normandy campaign, and y'all know that fantastic. And Mortain has needed a new evaluation for a long, or in the context of Saint-Lô and Mortain for a long time, because I think the last two books we have are Mortain, Mark Reardon's Victory at Mortain, Alwyn Featherstone's. The Featherstones must be at least 30 years old. Reardon's probably at least 20 years old, and there's some new understanding now, particularly with the use of air power and artillery. I'll put in touch with Matt Bone, who's the guy who done all the Typhoon research, because we'll talk about that offline or in a future show. But yeah, so much stuff. 30th, I love the 30th.
Well, two things. One is you've told me I mispronounced the name of the town, which is awesome. And two, I'm going to do it just like Corregidor, just like Rock Force. I got a couple veterans that I'm going to sort of ground the story, and we're going to do it just the same way. So I will offline hit you up because I'm going to be in France probably early next year to do more research. So I'll need.
Brilliant. Well, there's a pint of Guinness or whatever your tipple of choice is here waiting for you in Bayeux, and we'll go down and do I love the 30th Division. It's something I've done a little bit of research into, and there's a couple of guys I know, Frank Gubbles in Holland, who's done a lot of stuff about the 30th Division, who knows some veterans and things as well, and so we can work on that. But anyway, we're digressing into a World War II TV rabbit hole. But I'm just going to remind folks we've got kind of coming up this week, and I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So, folks, tomorrow we're continuing Airborne Week. James Daly is coming on to talk about the airborne operations that were cancelled between Operation Overlord and Market Garden. So the various operations. Then we've got Prit Boutard, the wonderful Prit, coming on talking about Soviet airborne operations on Thursday and Friday. We're off to Sicily with Mark Saliger for Primosole Bridge, the amazing attack by the British Airborne, and Durham Light Infantry. I'm mentioning for my mate Colin, who took that important bridge in the middle of Sicily that we're talking about Friday. So I'm really looking forward to them. As usual, folks, don't forget to check out what we're doing on Patreon. Check us out on Twitter. Check out Kevin's Twitter account. The links to purchase Kevin's book are in the description below, as are the links to his website. I recommend it, endorse it. It's fantastic. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's Band of Brothers in Corregidor, but it's that kind of where you follow a group of characters through, and there's some context, but not too much that it kind of bogs you down with, as we said earlier, 5th Corps doing this and 6th Corps doing that. It gets the right balance. So, well, it remains me to say thank you very much, Kevin, for joining us. And did you enjoy it?
This is great. I look forward to it. It was really a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
And come back and talk about both of those subjects. And I'm going to go off and with a smile now that there's a potential 30th Division book coming out. I'm actually kind of slightly excited now. It's I look at my shelves and I think, there's a need. An 8th Infantry Division is the next one we need as well, beyond the 30th. That's okay. Another unsung unit here, because everyone just goes back to the same units again, which is fantastic. But no, I kind of fall in love with you, as I said a minute ago. It's fantastic.
Well, save a spot. The book is sold. I just got to write it now. So thank you very much. All right.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for watching. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV. I will see you all again tomorrow. So again, thank you for giving us your company, folks. And thank you, Kevin. And I'm going to smile for the rest of the day now. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you.